Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare & Company. Perhaps the most apt description I've heard of the Overstory, and perhaps the one most likely to please its author, came in a glowing review from The Observer. The Overstory, the headline declared, is a majestic redwood of a novel. For those of you who've already read Richard Powers' 12th book, you'll understand what a compliment this comparison is. For in reading it, we come to understand what magnificent, mysterious, complex beings trees can be. Itself arboreally structured with 4 sections, roots, trunk, crown and seed, the Overstory introduces readers to 9 principal protagonists whose lives sprout, intertwine, branch off and in certain cases bear fruit. Such a rich cast allows Richard Powers to explore our relationship with the natural world in a manner that doesn't shirk the political complexity of our perilous ecological position or offer easy solutions. Instead, The Overstory is a novel with a fierce moral core that acknowledges and engages with our ecological predicament through compelling, conflicted characters. A meticulously researched and utterly fascinating read. The Overstory is a novel that will change the way you see the world. In addition to The Overstory, Richard Powers is the author of 11 novels, including Orfeo, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, The Echo Maker, The Time of Our Singing, Galatea 2.2, and Ploughing the Dark. He's the recipient of a MacArthur Grant and the National Book Award and has been a Pulitzer Prize and 4-time NBCC finalist. He lives in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. Shortlisted just last week for the 2018 Man Booker Prize, The Overstory was called an exhilarating read by The Times, astonishingly light on its feet by The Telegraph, and epically ambitious by The Evening Standard. Writing in The Guardian, Ben Markovits called The Overstory an extraordinary novel and an astonishing performance, adding, like Moby Dick, The Overstory leaves you with a slightly adjusted frame of reference. While Anne Patchett declared it the best novel ever written about trees, and really just one of the best novels, period. Please join me in welcoming Richard Powers to Shakespeare & Company. And so I think we're going to begin this evening with a short extract from the very beginning of the book.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for the generous intro, Adam. Lovely.
Pleasure. Thank you for the book.
When we were discussing what to read, is it audible?
You bet.
Okay. It occurred to me that the very short overture at the beginning of the book was the perfect length, probably about a 5-minute read. And it also occurred to me that if you can't read the first page of your novel without long justification and setting, you're in trouble. So let me give it a try. It isn't a representative of the many narrative styles once I have a human focalizer on the page, but it is a good representation of a recurring voice in which the trees themselves are the focalizers, if not to say the protagonists. First there was nothing, then there was everything. Then, in a park above a western city after dusk, the air is raining messages. A woman sits on the ground, leaning against a pine. Its bark presses hard against her back, as hard as life. Its needles scent the air and a force hums in the heart of the wood, her ears tuned down to the lowest frequencies. The tree is saying things, in words before words. It says, sun and water are questions endlessly worth answering. It says, a good answer must be reinvented many times from scratch. It says, every piece of earth needs a new way to grip it. There are more ways to branch than any cedar pencil will ever find. A thing can travel everywhere, just by holding still. The woman does exactly that. Signals rain down around her like seeds. Talk runs far afield tonight. The bends in the alders speak of long ago disasters. Spikes of pale chinkapin flowers shake down their pollen. Soon they will turn into spiny fruits. Poplars repeat the wind's gossip. Persimmons and walnuts set out their bribes, and rowans their blood-red clusters. Ancient oaks wave prophecies of future weather. The several hundred kinds of hawthorn laugh at the single name they're forced to share. Laurels insist that even death is nothing to lose sleep over. Something in the air's scent commands the woman, close your eyes and think of willow. The weeping you see will be wrong. Picture an acacia thorn. Nothing in your thought will be sharp enough. What hovers right above you? What floats over your head right now? Now. Trees even farther away join in. All the ways you imagine us, bewitched mangroves up on stilts, a nutmeg's inverted spade, gnarled Baja elephant trunks, the straight-up missile of a sal, are always amputations. Your kind never sees us whole. You miss the half of it, and more. There's always as much below ground as above. That's the trouble with people, their root problem. Life runs alongside them, unseen, right here, right next, creating the soil, cycling water, trading in nutrients, making weather, building atmosphere, feeding and curing and sheltering more kinds of creatures than people know how to count. A chorus of living wood sings to the woman. If your mind were only a slightly greener thing, we'd drown you in meaning. The pine she leans against says, listen, there's something you need to hear.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a very appropriate way to open the evening as well, because it gives us a sense of the vastness and the world contained within this book. I mean, I mentioned in the introduction there are 9 principal characters, which is already hugely ambitious.
And I think I name check about 300 trees, so so the humans are easy to keep track of.
And I'm just curious, where a book of this vast ambition and this vast scope finds its seed, actually. Could you take us back to the genesis of the novel? What was it that led to the journey that became the Overstory?
Well, I have to confess that I made it through about 55 years of my life without being able to tell an elm tree from an ash tree. I mean, like most of us, I saw them, I guess, in a way, and I always acknowledged beautiful ones, but they were pretty much aesthetic objects, and it wasn't until a stint that I spent as a professor at Stanford in Northern California that something changed in me. And for those of you who know, Palo Alto's right in Silicon Valley. I mean, it's just right at the center of the digital revolution. I mean, what's there? And the corporate headquarters of Google and Apple and HP and Intel and Netflix and Tesla and all the companies that have created the present and who are busily, very happily creating our future. And it's an intense place. I mean, that's a go-go culture, and there are a lot of people there who are pretty sure they're going to live forever because technology is going to come through for them, and it's, So when that all got a bit much for me, I would head up to the west. So, to the east is just this narrow little strip of inventing the future that runs from San Francisco to San Jose. And to the west of that is the Santa Cruz Mountains, which are covered in redwood forest. And to escape the future, I would often go back up into the past and take long hikes in the set-aside land in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And what I guess I didn't really realize the first few times that I hiked up there is that all those forests are actually second growth redwood forests, that those had all been cut down to build San Francisco, not once but twice, right, after the fire. And you forget that because a redwood can do a hell of a lot in 100 years. I mean, anybody who's seen these forests, you could easily mistake these trees for fully mature trees. You're walking in what feels like the largest cathedral you could possibly be in. And it wasn't until one day when I came across a survivor, a real old one that had, for whatever reason, escaped the loggers. This tree, it was as wide as this room. It was really 25, 30 feet, across, and 300 tall, and as old as Christianity. You're looking at something that even, you don't have to be a particularly sensitive soul to see something like this and say, my God, I did not know what life could do. And it's like watching a blue whale just pop up in a pod of dolphins, and I just thought, this is what this forest would have been dominated by 200 years ago. They wouldn't have all been this big, but the whole notion of what was happening up in those mountains, my notion changed as I saw this thing. And something clicked, and I thought, well, wait a minute. If these trees built San Francisco, and San Francisco is the reason that Silicon Valley is here, there's some patrimony here, there's some legacy that we're just not acknowledging. We've just erased it from, it's a little bit like, well, yeah, I did date that woman for 20 years, but she didn't have a big effect on my life, right? That's what we were doing. We were saying, no, we did this all by ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, wait a minute, there's a link here that I've never seen treated in literary fiction. Some relation between the human and non-human, some legacy, some interdependence that's just never been in the story. I have to try that.
And that, I guess, is something which one might say is easier said than done.
Well, yes.
Because if you're looking at sort of traditional novelistic techniques and the way that time is often portrayed in novels. It's not, novels don't work on a time scale that allows trees to be protagonists.
Yeah. My original desire was to make the trees the real protagonists, to actually have them as the heroes of the book. There were some technical difficulties associated with that, right? And the largest one is, the time is certainly a big one, and activity, at least as we ordinarily measure it, is another one. But the biggest is what one of my character's father says to her in the course of the book. A girl, Patricia Westerford, Patty, she's hard of hearing and consequently has a speech impediment. She's made fun of mercilessly by her schoolmates. She can't believe her father is an agricultural extension agent and has raised her in the constellations of the plant world. And this girl can understand the green world better than she can understand her own kind. And she says, why is it? How can all these people I go to school with, they have no idea. They can't tell one from the other. What is that? And her father says, that's Adam's curse. We only can identify with things that look like us. Mm-hmm. It's kind of sad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, the challenge is to see how far you can create identification and empathy for something that we do still share a quarter of our genes with, something that makes our lives possible, but is so alien to us. And when we actually understand the complexities of the behavior of trees, it's like these things are from Mars, right? So the trick was obviously to get the human intermediaries on stage, mm-hmm. to start to hook people in, to tell, to hook a reader in by the passions and the confusions and the bewilderments of ordinary people, get as broad a palette of personality types and backgrounds as I could, and then once they were saying, hey, I got to find out what happens to these people. And you say, okay, you've taken that, you got to take these other guys along with you. Right?
And once we do bring in those human intermediaries, in the first part of the book, so which is entitled Roots, right, we find each of their backstories. They're the 9 different roots, I want to say, but ROUTES, that brought them to have an interest with, and indeed a connection with trees. And in a lot of these stories, there is something dramatic that takes place in their life. Either it can be a physical injury, it can be the loss of somebody close to them, that seems to propel them to a closeness to these trees, or a greater connection to trees and to nature.
Almost a kind of conversion moment in a way, like my own.
Indeed. But I'm curious, do you think there is something almost necessary about a sort of a dramatic event to sort of, I don't know, to decenter people, to expand their concerns beyond their own person?
I think it could probably come in very different ways. I'm not sure it always has to be dramatic, but here's what I do believe. I do believe that most of us are so deeply colonized by this idea that we're the only game in town, and that meaning is a private thing, a personally generated thing, and that nothing else really has agency, and that the rest of creation is here basically to be a resource to us, that we've so deeply internalized it that it shocks us to think that there actually might be another way of looking at the world, and that there was another way of looking at the world for most of human history in most cultures. So to get to spin somebody out of a deeply addicted and deeply compelled and hugely internalized way of looking may take something fairly dramatic. And that's why I think, as you say, a lot of the nine main human protagonists have to have that moment where the scales drop from their eyes a little bit.
And they all come from different backgrounds and have different centers of interest, and what draws them to their interest in trees and the protection of trees. There's a vast array of motivations, and as a writer, that allows you, I guess, to explore trees and our human connection to trees from many different angles. So you already mentioned Patricia, whose route into her interest, obviously through her father, but she's a practicing scientist as well. And there's, for example, Nile, who comes from a sort of a technological...
South Asian, first generation South Asian. His father was an engineer on an early microprocessor project and so forth.
And yet his interest spins out of a passion with computers with technology.
Artificial life in the simulated world. One thing that we did that I take some pleasure in, for each of these characters, so Adam mentioned that the first part of the book is called Roots, and it reads a bit like 7 different short stories. Two of the characters are joined, so it will be 8 different short stories, I guess. And initially, there's a kind of confusion that I hope feels somewhat compelling to a first-time reader, where they say, "Wait, I thought I bought a novel. Why am I starting again and again and again?" So the first 120 pages of the book almost feels like a short story anthology, although you begin to see after a while that there is this common thread, which is the neighbors are injecting themselves into the lives of all these people. And what we did is take these old 19th century botanical engravings as a chapter head for each of these characters, and if you can identify the engraving, the species of the tree involved, you'll have a little bit of a key for understanding which species it is that's paralleling this person or conscripting their life in a certain way.
Which is, you give us a little hint about that, actually, because one of the characters grows up with his parents. Each time a new child is born into the family,
that's right,
they adopt a tree at the same time, and it allows us to start imagining a parallel between the personality or the characteristics of the tree and of the child,
and to have it actually in the consciousness of the character as a parallel, which may or may not be overtly known. I mean, for instance, the very first chapter deals with a Norwegian immigrant who comes to New York in the mid-19th century, just before the Civil War, and he's building ships in New York, but then hears about this opportunity to get land in Iowa, to homestead in Iowa. And he and his bride go out to the Midwest, which is a recurring venue for me as a writer, having spent many years in Illinois. And he discovers when he's there that he has accidentally transported some chestnut seeds with him from New York, and he tries to plant them on the prairie, and they actually do. One of them actually does survive the first few brutal years out there, and this tree becomes this kind of time lapse as the generations of this family rise and fall. One of the descendants of the original settlers gets this idea, and he's machine obsessed, so he's going to get his Brownie camera and take a picture of that tree on a certain day, the same day of each month. There's not a whole lot to photograph in Iowa, so so you do what you can, and after decades, he's got this stack of photos that become the strangest, slowest, most boring silent film ever to be filmed in Iowa. And his son takes over from him, and the descendants take over from him. And as this tree is spiraling upwards, this majestic chestnut tree, two things are happening. One, the human lives are scurrying about in the foreground of this flip book as if it's some kind of time-lapse thing where, instead of seeing the tree as some glacially, barely moving, agent, you see the tree in its own time frame, and you see the human lives disappearing and reappearing and living out these intense dramas in a paragraph and a half. It just flies by. But then, of course, for those of you who know the chestnut's destiny in North America, there is this concurrent story of the blight that enters into the country around 1904, and by 1940, almost every mature chestnut in the United States is dead, except for one that's so far out of the native range that it's never exposed to the pathogen. Anyway, that's the kind of way that I try to set up narratives so that tree time becomes dramatic.
And it also, this sense of tree time also underlines, I guess, one of the human difficulties in understanding the importance of trees and our relation to trees, and the sort of the symbiotic relationship we have with them, is that it's difficult without these kind of imaginative exercises.
That's right.
To really understand the effect the trees have on us, the impact that they have on our lives. There's moments, for example, you write about trees migrating.
Yeah. So there's this, the first time that you realize that these stories are actually going to, or have already in a sense, converged, and all you're looking at is the sort of reverse engineered backstories of stories of people whose lives already have come together in this pursuit that maybe we'll talk about in a moment, is when the woman Patricia, who I spoke of earlier, devotes her life to science. She is one of the early discoverers of these remarkable abilities of trees to send signals over the air chemically to each other, to share immune systems. She's of course ridiculed and driven out of her largely male-dominated field that doesn't have a lot of room for this notion of cooperation in what is at that time construed as mainly a competitively driven understanding of ecology. In any case, she's gone underground and has lived a kind of vagabond life after leaving her field. She ends up out west to see one of the world's oldest large organisms. And this is a clonal colony of aspens in Utah. And for those of you who know about this tree, I mean, an individual aspen stem is usually not much older than 75, 100 years. But you see, underground, they're all coming up clonally from the same root mass. And the root mass itself can be, they don't even know. I mean, they don't even know to the nearest order of magnitude. It could be 100,000 years, it could be 1,000,000 years. But one intriguing thing about these colonies out west is that they're actually older. They're older than the last ice sheet. How does that happen? Well, it's because this enormous colony has been growing on one end and dying off on the other end, and this stand of aspens has been traveling up hills and down dales for thousands of years. Yeah. So that's another way of somehow bringing human time and tree time into the same place.
Let's talk about, you mentioned the pursuit that ultimately brings these 9 characters together.
Yeah, and I forgot, I started this parentheses and didn't close it. That's the first moment where the omniscient author says, oh, and by the way, this person who you read about is doing this at this moment, and this person is there. Just as as we come to understand that the aspens are all connected underground, that's your first little glimpse narratively that all these characters are connected underground too, and they're migrating and they're moving toward their destiny. Sorry. Yeah.
Quite all right.
Yeah.
So the pursuit that brings them together is this quest to protect the last remaining giant redwoods, the last remaining ancient forests in the United States. Right.
So here in France, I mean, I guess it's pretty safe to say there really is no more primary forest in France, or very, very little.
As far as I know.
Yeah. And if anybody knows otherwise, I'd love to hear about it.
I checked on Wikipedia after I saw your
in Vincennes.
And there's just a few left. It's a couple of hundred square acres.
Oh, yeah, so that's small. Yeah. So
there are some nature reserves.
Wow, yeah. What I was stunned to discover when I was researching my book is that of these 4 vast forests that covered North America when the Europeans first came, that 98% of them have been cut. And the forests that you see now, by and large, are regrowth forests or tree plantations, tree farms, right? So by far most of the forest in the United States is regrowth. And the astonishing thing is that even as late as the 1990s and the early 2000s, where much of the book is set, that last 2% was still being cut. In fact, it's still being cut now. So, that bewilderment is the bewilderment that my characters are confronted with. Honestly, are you saying we can't just make this leap and say, okay, we got pretty much all of it. Let's have a few vestiges, just because to have an archive, to have a little bit of memory, I mean, we don't know biologically what's going on in there. In fact, it'd be really interesting to come back. We didn't know until a few determined people went up a very short time ago, just a couple of decades ago, that the canopy of a redwood forest was this incredibly rich ecosystem with endemic species, with stuff like salamanders that are born up in little pools up there and live out their whole lives up there and reproduce generations after generations. So there's so much that we don't know. What we do know is that no human being on Earth who has ever lived has ever seen an old growth ecosystem come back after clear cutting. Right? People speculate. They say, well, it'll take 1,000 years to get all that mycorrhizal connection back and all the different interplays of species and the climax, interdependence, all booked back in. They're just guessing. I mean, because we've never seen it, we don't know how long it would take, and whatever comes back isn't going to be what was there, right? So that's the moral outrage that these characters are confronted with, and there's a strong tradition in America. It started with a guy named Thoreau. When the law's not right, you're okay to try to confront it. Well, long story short, and it's no great spoiler, it's harder than it seems to oppose the destiny, the economic rationality of mankind.
And while I said that sort of all of these characters are each very different from the other, one thing that perhaps the only thing that really unites them is none of them are really what you might call natural-born activists.
Oh, absolutely. There isn't a single character there that's politically inclined at the start of the story.
And I'm curious if that sort of connects to something in your mind that as you were writing the book, because as I said in the introduction, it is a fiercely moral book, and
Right.
it's a book which in sort of many sort of varied and subtle way does take a very strong position.
It does.
And-
It does. Unlike a lot of literary fiction.
Right, exactly. So
Right.
that was going to be my question. Like, was this sort of this question of, perhaps not feeling naturally like an activist, but
Right.
also feeling the moral outrage, and also feeling this, your way of communicating your what's going on in your mind and what you've learnt is through fiction.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about the sort of the tensions, if there were any, in sort of measuring that into a literary novel?
Yeah, and the tensions are many, and they're continuing as people read the book, and as the book is discussed publicly in critical forums. So little patience, because it's going to take a tiny bit to establish this. But a lot of you may have come across a similar formula in your formative literary classes. I just remember in junior high school, my beloved Mrs. Ferlette telling me, there are 3 sources of dramatic tension that you can build a story around. And she was sexist, Mrs. Ferlette. She belonged to her age. But so we would say man against man, or a person against person against his or herself, right? And person against the environment. So an individual holding incommensurable values. If I'm honest, I will betray my friend. Do I stay with loyalty, or do I stay with honesty? So that makes a great story. A person at odds with his or herself. And then there's, you hold one value, you believe fiercely in liberty, I believe fiercely in equality, and we're going to go at it, So that's, the first is the psychological novel, right? The second is the sociological or political novel. This third novel has disappeared. I don't know about world literature, but it's certainly disappeared from the American tradition and from the English language tradition. And in fact, when we think about it, when was the last book that I read that was people against the non-people, the non-humans? Jack London, you look back, to these books that basically now seem kind of quaint to us, because didn't we win that war? Isn't that over? There's no more drama there, right? So that's what happened. Just kind of dropped out altogether, because we were under the impression that there was nothing more to say about we're getting along with the rest of the world. We simply just mastered it. We just controlled it. Well, we now know otherwise. That the world that does not share our values is coming back to haunt us. And I predict that there will be all kinds of new books that resurrect this form of drama as a prevailing mode in literary fiction. But in the meantime, literary fiction sort of, in a very defensible way, reached the conclusion that the best way to do these moral arguments is in a kind of dialogical fashion, where all the laudable characters are shown to be flawed, and all the so-called villains are shown actually to be, somehow empathizable. You can see their point, and the key art in literary fiction is, the prevailing thing to aspire toward is a kind of moral relativism, a kind of complex impossibility of resolving these rich dilemmas. To be sympathetic, as Bakhtin I think says, you can't identify the author's position because all possible moral positions are treated so sympathetically and yet interrogated so deeply that you simply move from one to the other. And my suspicion was, wait a minute, doesn't that still beg the question in the actual sense of the phrase beg the question? Doesn't that assume that meaning is completely subjective? Isn't it already buying into this kind of individualist, commodity, culture, human-centric position? What if there really is meaning out there, right? What if the living world sets patterns that we have to come to understand and we have to come to accommodate? And that was I think that's my goal line defense against people who say, why aren't there more sympathetic villains in this book? And I'm just saying, because actually there's something we have to figure out, right? It's not really that ambiguous. We've treated ourselves as an exceptional, independent, autonomous agent. And we can't. I mean, we can't survive that way, and we're not. I mean, we are deeply imbricated with the rest of the living world. And I didn't want to mince around with moral ambiguity about that. I just wanted to write a book that says this is the case.
And it's interesting that people might say, sort of, why are there no sort of empathizable villains?
Right.
Because in a sense, there aren't really any sort of human nameable villains in the book. So even there's a moment where one of the characters has been, several of the characters have been disrupting the logging companies, and they get into sort of exchanges with some of the people who work for these companies, who are described as decent people loving the land in irreconcilable ways.
That's right.
And you can well imagine it. I mean, these, people who work for the logging companies are just trying to support their families and just...
Yeah, and I do try to treat them sympathetically. And actually there's a moment, one of my favorite parts of the book is when two of the protagonists go up and do a tree sit, 200 plus feet up in the air in a gigantic old redwood. And there were many, many of these tree sits in the 90s and early 2000s. And you may know of one of the most famous ones, the Julia Butterfly Hill, and the beautiful book that she wrote about her time up in the redwood Luna. And much of what I do is draws on her for research. But they're up there, and the cutters are harassing them every day. They come and they try to cajole them down out of the trees, and we'll drop charges if you come down now, and look, it's going to happen one way or the other. And there's even a moment where they start felling trees nearby, and without worrying as where the fall is going to be. But then one night there's a colossal storm, right? And these two survive just barely, as this colossal tree is doing this pendulum in the air. And the next morning the cutters show up and they say, are you all right? We just want to make sure that you're all right. Yeah. So there are moments of human grace even among the conflicting sides.
Indeed, and I would say it's sort of, for me, in reading it, the villains of the piece, so to speak, seem to be more the sort of the systems and certain sort of concretized ways of thinking about the world that allow the last sort of ancestral forests to be cut down.
I would say if there's any villainy or any evil in the book, it's just that small part of us that we all share that takes miracles for granted, And one of the characters is a psychology student, right.
And he's working on his, if I remember rightly, his master's degree, PhD.
It's a PhD thesis,
PhD, and one of his interests is groupthink, is sort of confirmation bias. It's can people come to independent moral decisions that run sort of counter to their tribe's belief, I think you refer to it. And that seems to be a really fascinating area for exploration, particularly in relation to ecology, and particularly in the way we relate to it as a species. So you talk about the so-called the bystander effect.
Right. So those of you who may have come across Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, great summary of cognitive bias, cognitive blindness, will know about his wonderful discussions of the Kitty Genovese syndrome, or the bystander effect, where something catastrophic happens. You're up in your apartment and you hear cries in the street, and you rush to the window, but you see that there are other people around too, other people who have rushed to their windows, and the assumption is, well, if it's really, really bad, someone will have called the police by now, right? And in fact, psychologists have demonstrated experimentally, with amazing experiments, that there's a certain threshold. Like when there are only 2 or 3 other people, we're much more likely to engage and intervene. But when there's a lot of people, almost everyone just defers to the assumption that the group will take care of it somehow. And Adam's work is basically showing that perhaps that's what's happening in the face of environmental catastrophe. Perhaps we're just all guilty of assuming if there were really a problem, we wouldn't have let it get so bad.
Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of the fact there will be questions from the audience, so I'm going to finish my question just talking about the role of a moral novel like this, the role of the writer in this quest to get people to behave differently, right, to recognize the miracle that surrounds them. Are you optimistic that the novel as a form is still relevant in a way to have a significant impact on the way people act and the way that people live?
There's almost... I don't know what the novel can and can't do. But I do know I can't think of any other place that's better suited to bringing the complexity of the personal and the scientific and the affective and the emotional all together in one vessel. And maybe whether it can or can't make a difference isn't the question. And the question may be, what would the first necessary step of the transformation in consciousness be? Mm-hmm. And I just know that personally, as an author, when I got the first letter from a reader saying, I'm not looking at trees the same way anymore, I think, the activism has begun, and that's enough. Mm.
On which note, it's over to you. If you have a question for Richard Powers, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you so everybody can hear. We'll begin with this young lady over there.
I have a question. You said you talked about this character, about this girl who could connect more with trees than with people, and the father saying that. What was the thing the father said to her again?
He says it's Adam's curse. We only can care about things that look like us.
Okay, but I'm from Germany, and we have a lot of World War II history in our school.
Right.
Like, it's all we learn.
Right.
And I've been to a concentration camp, and there have been people that said to me that they couldn't really sympathize with the extreme emotional reaction I had to this place because they didn't feel like they have a connection to it. These were like German children raised by German people,
right.
parents. So, but she cried watching Marley and Me, and could more sympathize to that fictional dog.
Right.
So,
right.
I don't think it's really people can sympathize with other things, but people. So, what is that?
Yeah.
That. I don't know, that gap.
It's a complicated and a rich and a wonderful question. And in this formulation, they have to look like us. That's the catch, right? There's another one of my characters who says, all the facts in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that will do that is a good story, right? Now, in this question of what we permit ourselves to feel empathy toward and what we don't, somehow the film Marley and Me made that dog somehow, do you know what I mean, gave it a good story and made it seem recognizable and the emotions recognizable and so forth. That person may also have been deeply anesthetized, may have felt incapable of extending empathy on the scale that Holocaust sites demand from us, right? So it may be possible that in one case she or he allowed herself or himself to hear the story, and in the other simply rejected the story. I don't know, and it's not the degree of literal similarity. There's an interesting article in my book. Actually, I cite it, but it was a famous environmental essay written in the early 70s by Christopher Stone, and it was called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And at the beginning of this piece, he traces out this amazing fact. He says, the history of people is the history of extending personhood where there wasn't personhood. There was a time when children were not considered to be legal persons. A parent could put their child to death legally in ancient Rome, right, without any consult with the state. There was a time when women were not considered fully legal persons, or other races, right, or other religions. The mentally handicapped, right, the ill, the insane, the disabled. All of these had to get personhood. So the history of humanity is gradually teaching or learning the ability to empathize farther and farther out in what didn't seem initially to resemble me, but I have learned to see it as resembling me. Stone says, why stop there? There's a whole world of interdependence that we have to learn to see our personal affinity with and connection to. And his point is in the context of the law. He says to bring a suit against someone, you have to have a human plaintiff. You have to have someone who's been damaged, either physically injured or has suffered property loss of some kind. And as you know, in Germany, part of the problem was that Jews did not have legal standing, so the whole question of applying the law equitously was problematic. But Stone is saying, if there's toxins being dumped into the river, you can't sue on behalf of the river. You can't sue on behalf of the mountain or on behalf of the forest. There has to be some human being down river who suffers. There's something wrong with that. We have to rethink what we think legal protection is all about.
And yet you can sue on behalf of a corporation.
Yeah, and corporations are people, and ships are people, and universities are people, but not trees, right? And not the creatures that our existence depends on. There's something somewhat short-sighted about that. Yeah.
Okay, the gentleman just there. We'll get the microphone to you.
Yeah, so Richard, I loved the book. It was the best Richard Power since a very long time.
Oh, bless you.
Even though I say that about every one of your books. It's kind of interesting because the last question related to should non-human objects be treated as human?
Right.
And it was something I was thinking about as well, especially after the Vincennes, when a lot of people were talking essentially, if the human race disappears tomorrow, it would be an interesting experiment and so on.
Right.
But I detect after having read your book that at your heart you're a humanist, and you do have an idea that perhaps we might possibly save ourselves before it's too late. Although a lot of recent fiction, in fact, a lot of thought about a lot of stuff you said made me think about a lot of stuff. But for instance, the novels from Kim Stanley Robinson, New York 2140,
right.
where in fact the Earth is a character more or less in the book. But in most of those books where things go badly wrong, people only manage to fix things after a lot of the bad stuff has already happened.
Right.
And so the question is, are we because the book is a bit hopeful at the end that we are going to fix things before it gets too bad. I'm wondering, would you comment on that. And the other thing, I guess the reason
comment on those 10 things.
And I guess the reason why the book is written in the present tense is because trying to bring across this notion of tree time that you talk about in the introduction. So I'll stop there.
It's the standing now. It's the eternal present that the narrative tries to invoke. So, am I a humanist? A crypto-humanist. There is a character in the book who's a bad girl. She's an undergraduate. She's she's majoring in actuarial science. She knows she's about to flunk out. She's a drug user and a hedonist, and she throws herself a little party one night because she just got divorced, and she gets really, really high, and she starts to masturbate, and she accidentally electrocutes herself on the lamp over her bed, and she dies. And that ends the chapter. And then the next chapter is 90 seconds later she revives. So she has a near-death experience. But as so often happens in near-death experiences, it's another form of the conversion moment that you were talking about earlier. I drew on this actually from a remarkable story called The Man Who Planted Trees, where he actually dies and is revived, and there's a mission now. There are voices talking to this woman, and the voices are saying, the most remarkable product of 4 billion years of evolution needs your help. And throughout the whole book, she's convinced that they mean trees. And, well, I can't give out too many more secrets about the book, but in the final pages, those who survive her realize, oh no, the most remarkable development of 4 billion years of evolution does need your help. It's us. It's us. You know, consciousness,
That's amazing.
that's something. It's worth protecting. It's worth preserving. But it's only going to be preserved if it goes back home. If it acknowledges that it isn't the Lord and Master, it's just another creature in the undergrowth.
There was a... Okay. There was a hand at the back there. We'll get to this lady first and then to this gentleman.
Two of the characteristics that I love about your work in general are the trust in the reader and the impressive research. And I was wondering how you manage to navigate the question of reconciling trust in the reader, not spelling out everything,
Right.
and also leaving doors open for him to enter the novel and the story.
Well, thank you for saying that, because it doesn't always work, right? There are plenty of readers who, for whom it doesn't work. I treat my readers the way that I would like to be treated. And I simply know when it's done for me, I resist it. And when I get to do it, oh, what amazing discoveries happen, right? So that for me, that's the guideline. You know, would I feel led if it were presented to me in this way? As for the amount of research, that's also not for everybody. And there are plenty of people who think that's not the novel, you know, that's not the job of the novel. I like Horace, you know, the poet, the classic poet, Horace's famous dictum, you know, what's the purpose of literature? To instruct and delight. And I happen to be the kind of reader for whom those are the same thing. I mean, the more, bring it on, you know, the more I can learn along the way while I'm laughing or crying or doing all the other affective things that you do with the novel, the more the novel takes seriously the domain in which it is deployed, the more I end that book saying, I went somewhere I'd never been, right? Now in this case, see, for some readers in other books where it's artificial intelligence or virtual reality or corporate history or something, that's going to be a slog, because where's the humanity, where's the warmth and the, so, my point, which is, that is the humanity, doesn't always work in topics like that. But trees, a lot, I think people who couldn't make the journey before might say, oh, wait a minute, I know about these, or I feel affinity there. I'm willing to go a little bit farther. And for me, I love the research more than I love writing. I always have to kind of force myself to say, instead of saying, oh, no, just one more book, please, let me just read one more before, this time, I just, it was the greatest pleasure in the world to spend those 6 years just learning everything that I could, And, I think I ended up reading 120 book-length studies of trees. And I'm still reading them even though the book is finished now,
Okay, that gentleman
there. Oh, great.
One of my favorite books, other than yours, is a book that was written in, I think, the shadow of the Cold War. It's George Stewart's The Earth Abides.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
He was from your neck of the woods.
Right.
I think he was part of Stegner's
That's right.
writing program. Anyway, it's like dystopian novel before dystopian novels were catching on. What would you think if our species was wiped out? Do you think the Earth would return to what it was before, or do you think it would become something different?
Yeah, and this
That's multiple choice.
right, right. It's not a binary. Okay. Here's what I know. I know that we've been around for about 200,000 years, roughly, in our current state, with a curve that basically goes vertical on every way you want to measure it. Right. It's pretty brittle, the situation that we've built for ourselves. I mean, if you look just at the agricultural system itself, there are so many ways that it could go catastrophically wrong. So if you look to somebody like Aldo Leopold, who says, what's the ethic behind here? Systems that are complex and multiple and have lots of interdependencies are stable systems. Monocultures are very brittle and very susceptible to collapse. We've built ourselves a monoculture, basically, So if I were a betting man, if you say, are you hopeful? First, I'd say hopeful for what? And even if you said, are you hopeful for humanity? I'd say, not for this configuration of humanity. There's no way this is going much beyond where we are, right? But if you're saying hopeful for consciousness, I'd say that's a pretty robust adaptation. I mean, maybe one of the most robust, and that's what's made us so successful. So whatever happens, there will be an intense and a robust human response. Whether it can survive the catastrophes of its own making remains to be seen, or in what form it can survive. It won't be in this form. But if you're asking me hopeful for trees, I mean, they've been around for 350 million years or more, 400 million years. They've survived, multiple mass extinctions. This was such a great idea, by the way. Getting up on a woody trunk and sticking your arms out and spreading your solar cells and turning the sun into food. That's a good idea. That works. In fact, it worked so well that evolution invented it separately at least 6 different times. Right? I'm pretty hopeful that solution will survive whatever is thrown at it.
Okay, we've got time for a final question. This gentleman's been waiting.
Hello. I'd like to ask you about the word still.
Yes.
The significance.
Since we've given away everything else about the book, we might as well give away the last page.
If you consider it a spoiler.
No.
Okay,
I'm good
and
with
why
it.
why the people that help Nick, I think it is,
Right.
Why they are so receptive and why they
Right.
feel that this word needs to be told.
Right.
First.
So the setting is simply this. One of these 9 characters survives the cataclysm of confrontation, and decades later although he's no longer an activist in the recognizable sense, he has gone on working in his own art, producing these strange, large, sometimes cryptic installations, seemingly for no audience, right? But in fact, I'll say this: there is an audience, and you can see who's looking at the end of the book. But his final project that the book mentions is lining up dead logs on the forest floor of a northern forest, of arranging them to form this word, an immense word, S-T-I-L-L. Right? He's just shaping these trees into this word in the hopes that over the following centuries, as he's learned, these nurse logs will become the home for the next generation of trees. And that somewhere in the far future, there will be living trees that spell out this word that can be seen from high up in space. The question is, why that word still? Why that word still? And I think I'm going to revert to a previous questioner and say that exercise is left up to the reader. Thank you.
What a wonderful note to conclude on, and I would just like to reassure you that we certainly have not revealed everything that happens in the book. This is a book that spans generations, that takes you deep into the minds of many different characters. It's really an extraordinary piece of work, and you'll be delighted to hear that we have piles and piles of them available at the front desk, as well as many titles from Richard's backlist as well. Richard will be here signing book plates, which we have here for you. Have a choice either between the British one or the French one, since we straddle those two cultures. Do stick around, have a glass of wine with us, continue the conversation, and please join me one more time in saying thank you to Richard Powers.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Thank you.